Welcome back to this third panel, Incarceration, Decarceration, and Education, which is sort of formed around the notion that universities in particular have become centers for prison education and reentry programs, as well as abolitionist activity. How can we foster such programs in the future, and how might they relate to the decarceration movement? And our four panelists here, I'm going to introduce them very briefly all at once and then let them take over. First of all, Bernard Harcourt, who's a multifaceted intellectual and activist, professor at Columbia Law, founding director of the Initiative for a Just Society at Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, also directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the author of a dozen books, brilliant editor of several works by Michel Foucault, lawyer for death row prisoners in Alabama, and teacher at Rikers Island. And he'll be followed by Anton Henshaw, who's director of the Transformative Justice Initiative, which he founded to support the formerly incarcerated on their release from prison. You can see him on videos at the gate of East Jersey State Prison, the first to greet and embrace the newly released. Anton is also studying for his master's degree at the School of Criminal Justice of Rutgers University. Next, Zelda Rowland, Yale BA and PhD, who is the founding director of the Yale Prison Education Initiative, which she almost single-handedly has made an enormous success, including the award of a large enabling grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. She coordinates the Yale program with the Connecticut Department of Corrections and with a committed group of Yale faculty and students and with the University of New Haven. And finally, our respondent, Ben Berger, teaches political science at Swarthmore, where he's executive director of the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility. And in this role, he's focused the center's mission on connecting the curriculum with the community. In particular, he's made prison education a vital locus of engaged scholarship, stressing the ways in which students inside and outside can co-create knowledge and change public perceptions and public policy. So I'll say no more and turn things over to Bernard Harcourt.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for an amazing conversation so far. I'd like to start with a series of epigraphs giving voice to writings from the prison. First is from George Jackson, Soledad Brothers, 1970. I met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao when I entered prison, and they redeemed me. For the first 4 years, I studied nothing but economics and military ideas. From his brilliant book, Blood in My Eyes, 1971. George Jackson again. I would be sitting in a special locked isolation cell, sometimes even with the lock welded shut, and there would be no one to talk to, just the sound of screaming voices. Because there's no human contact, you depend on books. No contact with people, special lock welded on the door, nobody around, I'm strictly by myself. The only friend I had was a book. Sometimes I'd find myself talking out loud to the author. I'd sort of wake myself up and I'd hear myself talking to this other person. I guess it was some kind of wish fulfillment. When I'm asleep at night, I still find myself talking to those guys. The next slide, yes, the next slide is, the next epigraph is from Albert Woodfox, a brilliant author of Solitary, the book Solitary, unbroken for 4 decades in solitary confinement. He spent 4 decades in solitary confinement. Sadly, he passed away a few months ago of COVID. The years in prison had worn his health down. He writes in Solitary, I turned my cell into a university, a hall of debate, a law school. Reading was my salvation. I first gravitated to books and authors that dealt with politics and race: George Jackson, Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Steve Biko, Eldridge Cleavers, Soul on Ice, J. Rogers, From Superman to Man. We read anything we could find on slavery, communism, socialism, Marxism, anti-imperialism, the African independence movements, and independence movements from around the world. Leaning against my wall in the cell, sitting on the floor, on my bed, or at my table, I read. The next epigraph is from a letter. It was a letter that was written to Albert Woodfox by a man on death row. And he'd sent it through his attorney, George Kendall, an old friend. And he'd sent a message to Mr. Woodfox in this handwritten letter dated December 9th, 2021. I tried to edit out some passages that but here's where he writes to Albert Woodfox, Oji Shaka Dingwe Sinkwe, which was his name inside. I myself and some other socio-politically conscious comrades have been having teach-in sessions with your book, Solitary, here on death row. It is deeply inspiring and motivational, and we wanted you to know this. An idea that just came to mind, and you'll be able to see a video of my conducting a demonstration on the 35th anniversary of the assassination of George Jackson. Just know that there are brothers down here who stand in that righteous tradition, and we are still fighting on. Guerrilla love and respect. Cycles of regenerative action. Regenerative cycles, spontaneous chain reactions, permanent revolutions. What's so remarkable about prison writing, about prison reading, about prison study, is the way in which the written word in prison circulates and recirculates and sparks and inspires and nourishes and sustains new revolutionary cycles. George Jackson encountered Marx and Mao in prison and became, as Dr. Joy James says, a dragon philosopher and revolutionary abolitionist, transforming himself and his prison comrades into the military wing of a vanguard party, the Black Panthers. Albert Woodfox reads George Jackson, right, as well as others, Mao's Little Red Book, and he too is turned revolutionary, co-founding the first official chapter of the Black Panther Party behind bars. Today, a person confined in death row reads Albert Woodfox, reading George Jackson, and is rejuvenated in his struggle against the oppression of his confinement and his sentence of death. Teach-in sessions in prison, reading groups in prisons. The cycle revolves, rejuvenating and transmitting the passion, the commitment, the struggle, the revolution, generating new political praxis. What happened in California in 2010s was simply remarkable, with the Short Corridor Collective, which was formed in the SHU, in the Secured Housing Unit, in isolation, basically, in Pelican State Prison. It was a collection of men held in solitary for being allegedly leaders of different racial gangs, including Todd Ashker, Arturo Castellanos, Antonio Gillen, Sitawa Jama, Paul Red, and others, and they formed a reading group to discuss the works of Bobby Sands and Cesar Chavez, the Black Panthers, Michel Foucault, and others. And as Professor Allegra McLeod recounts, she writes, although the men could not meet face to face or even see one another from their solitary cells, they were able to organize and read the same text, pass notes, talk to one another, pushing the pages torn from these books through the vents and the drains and the cracks in the walls so that they could share the texts. And they were able to talk with each other through the vents and discuss and formulate an understanding of their situation, the way in which the prison administration was using their racial identities to control them, a long journey that ultimately led them to to organize the country's largest ever prison hunger strike in 2013, involving more than 30,000 women and men throughout California prisons, who refused to eat, and ultimately leading to litigation and other organizing that ended indeterminate solitary confinement based on gang affiliations. Reading Bobby Sands, inspiring them to action. Also, what happened, we were talking earlier today about Jean Genet, right, who helps form the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, the group on prison information in 1970, reflecting particularly on George Jackson, on all facets of the prison and the repression at the time in France, but also in the United States, and ultimately fueling this text called The Assassination of George Jackson, of which Genet wrote the preface, but a text that would be published in France less than 3 months after George Jackson's homicide, right? As George Jackson is killed on August, I think it's 21, 1971, and this book is published by Gallimard with Jean Genet's preface in November, like November 10th of 71. And it's remarkable the way in which all of these works inspired others and philosophers to rethink the prison and rethink society, and had such extraordinary cyclical effects on philosophers like Michel Foucault, who, as a result of this work and his engagement in prison abolition in France at the time, comes up with a completely different model of our society based on civil war, right? And he would write in these important lectures he delivered at the Collège de France, the matrix of all struggles of power, of all strategies of power, and consequently also the matrix of all the struggles regarding and against power is the matrix of civil war. So, one of the questions we pose ourselves, of course, is how we engage in education in the prison. What's clear to me, of course, is as critical academics in our relationship to prison education, which is one of the most important aspects of our lives, what's remarkable is that these prison writings and experiences really convince me that the most genuine and authentic academy is the one that's created by the women and men behind bars, in solitary, on the short corridor, at Angola, or Parchman, or Rikers, right? In their reading groups and teach-ins and their critical examination. People behind bars form the true academy. And you can hear this. You can hear this in solitary. You can see it. It's tangible. You can feel it when a friend, Daryl Robertson, is released from Rikers Island, walking out of the New York County Criminal Courthouse at 100 Center Street in downtown Manhattan, carrying as his only property, his only possessions, 2 75-pound bags of books, more than 100 books on his back. This is the only thing that had got him through his time at Rikers. It becomes clear that these spaces built to confine, to punish, to do violence to men and women, these spaces are turned into by the people who are imprisoned there, the true and genuine academy where critical thought and debate is really most alive. Sometimes I feel like our ivory towers pale in comparison. There isn't the same drive, almost. There isn't the same hunger. There isn't the same need to read, to critique, to engage in praxis. So moving forward, and as we think about kind of education and justice in education. I think it's not always the question of what we academics contribute to the critique and praxis of men and women behind bars, but instead how can we in higher education transform ourselves to better model the relationship between critique and praxis in the true academy that the people in prison create. One final thought. These prison writings, they emerge out of the depths. De profundis, as Oscar Wilde called it. George Jackson himself wrote from those depths. Capture, he said, imprisonment is the closest to being dead that one is likely to experience in this life. Oscar Wilde also wrote from those depths. And during his time at the Reading prison, he was so deeply affected by the execution of a fellow prisoner, he wrote the ballad of Reading Gaol, the Reading jail. On his release, after 2 years of incarceration for the crime of homosexuality, he signed it C33. That was his prison number. And so it appeared, originally, anonymously. I think I'll finish with a verse from that beautiful text. This too I know, and wise it were if each could know the same, that every prison that men build is built with bricks of shame, and bound with bars, lest Christ should see how men their brothers maim. Thank you.
Do you want to speak there or at the podium? Either way.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm in a peculiar position because I'm blessed to be here, though. I am a lifer. I served 100% of a 30-year-to-life sentence in New Jersey's prisons. I was incarcerated in 1988, and I was released in 2018. As I listened all day, it's amazing how what we call inside liberation education makes this day possible. So for one, I'm humbled, I am blessed, and I thank you all for creating a space where I'm safe and I'm able to heal, and that we can heal together. Liberation education. I grew up in an environment, if you can imagine, where I wasn't supposed to survive. I was 5'4", 118 pounds, never incarcerated before, and I was sentenced to 30 years to life. And I didn't go to a youth facility. I went straight to an adult male facility, and I was sent there to die or to be fodder for the other bigger, stronger people. But I remember meeting two men at the orientation, and they asked me a question. What are you going to do? Play basketball and be in the yard, or go to school and get an education? Prior to my incarceration, education has always been my safe space. My mother abandoned me and my brother and sisters twice. My father raised us. He was an authoritarian. And it led to a lot of what I used to make decisions that led me to incarceration. But when those two men asked me what was I going to do, I immediately remembered my elementary school principal, Miss Fenderson, and I said school. I went to school, and I got my GED within 6 months after entering prison. And then I enrolled in a college program at Mercer County Community College in New Jersey to get an associate's degree. I remember the first semester, I got 2 A's. I really didn't think I was college material, but I was. And I went to sign up for the next semester, and the Pell Grants were gone. And immediately I'm like, what are you doing? I finally find something I like, I enjoy, I'm safe. And I'm in a maximum security prison, but I quickly learned that the most violent people don't like to be around books. Right? If you're in the library, if you're in the law library, they don't go around books or classrooms too tough. They hang around on the cell blocks and they want to run the block. They want to run the phone. They want to run the mess hall. They want to control the haircuts and all the things that don't really mean anything. All I cared about is that clock going to keep moving so I can get out of here. I was blessed to be around my prison father, Mr. Jerome Perkins. And I began to quickly learn from him the perils of structural violence. Right, and how systems became structurally violent, whether you participated in them or not. So we began to chart a course to get education back in prison. It took us 28 years to get it back. And I remember getting higher education back into New Jersey state prisons by writing a white paper to the legislators that went in a slew of bills, 4202. In New Jersey, and they took the section to make education mandatory in all New Jersey's prisons as it was written. And I remember she was assemblywoman then. She is now in the House of Representatives. Then Assemblywoman Bonnie Watson Coleman and a few other, Grace Spencer and Kohino and a few others came in, and we did our presentation. And education became mandatory inside New Jersey's prisons. Did I ever think that was possible, that they would listen to us? And then you began to see that it wasn't that we inside the carceral space didn't have voices. It was that our voices were silenced. And it took people coming from the outside to the inside to magnify those voices. And so the senators and the legislators started coming in, and they began to take the lead from the people and our families that were directly involved. We get to the point where I meet this wonderful man, Mr. Peter Brooks. At the time I was working on my BA, but at the same time I was going through the parole process, which was the most depressing and hard thing that I ever had to do. And Mr. Brooks brought in a detective class on detective and interrogations and techniques, and I remember reading all of these different tropes that he brought in. And I remember my first interview with the New Jersey State Parole Board, and 2 days prior to that interview, Professor Brooks, you don't like me calling him that down, but at the time, Professor Brooks brought in this video on the Reed technique of interrogation. And when I walked into the room of the two-man panel, they immediately began using the Reed technique of interrogation in my parole hearing. And 2 days prior, we had to write a reflection paper and an analysis on this stuff. I'm sitting there like, are they serious? But that's what we call liberation education, right? If you're not religious oriented, but I'm very spiritual. But I say there was some divine intervention there. I don't know what to call it or what it was, but it came in a moment when I needed the most to be able to understand what was about to happen and how the structural violence of a system was going to be perpetuated against me if I wasn't prepared educationally. So that system was able to push me through to the final level of the full board. And the way the full board went was totally different than the two-man panel. Now we know there's sharks in the room. So they're waiting to jump out. It's 12 people, and 2 of the 12 are going to attack you for absolutely no reason and try to provoke an emotional response to justify keeping you in prison. Now, mind you, I said I'm a lifer. That means I'm on parole for the rest of my life. I'm still a slave of the state of New Jersey. I have a travel pass to get here. And Professor Ben Berger had to be my escort in order for my plantation owners in New Jersey to give me permission to be in Connecticut. So for anybody that thinks slavery is over, it is not, right? This is why we have this national campaign, amend the 13th, to remove the exception clause from our national constitution and state constitution all throughout the country. So as we began to go through this process in the New Jersey State Parole Board, they began to ask me, in the read technique, they make you feel comfortable. Let's talk about your early childhood life, your best memories and things like that. And then all of a sudden, wham, let's talk about the day of your crime. No segue, no nothing. We just gonna get in it. What was you thinking? What were you feeling? Now, let's remember during the entire 30-year process, you are surviving. You are not thinking about the very thing that led you to that moment. And now in this interview, because it's not a hearing, it's an interview to see if you are qualified to serve the discretionary portion of your sentence in the community. It is a privilege. This is not a right. So we're going to see if our carceral slave can come back out amongst us under a convict leasing type system that we still have social control over this person. Sounds like a lot of philosophy, don't it? Foucault, Hobbes, Locke, right? But in order to associate that, we have to have the academies, with the academies that are inside building liberation education models to end the structural violence of systems. So I remember I got to one of the sharks, and he was a psych. 90% of the New Jersey State Parole Board are former law enforcement. So you have to know what audience you're speaking to. And he said to me, "You're a liar. Everything you said is a farce. It doesn't make sense. You're in here deceiving us." And he just went on with a litany of insults. And I sat there. And he asked a question later on. He said, "Well, you don't have anything to say?" And I simply said, "I'm here to answer questions. You made a statement." He said, "So like you guys just did," he said, and the people in the room all did the same thing. His own colleagues was like, he's right. But that becomes critically aware of a liberation education, to not get dragged into a conversation that's mainly built on accusations and not questions. I'm here to answer questions, nothing else. So he said, "Well, what do you think about what I said about you?" Now, again, be careful what you send across the net. You might not like what comes back. And so I answered him. I said, I know that if I lie, if I'm deceptive, if I'm not forthcoming in any way, that keeps me in prison for the rest of my life. And I would not waste your time nor mine. And if you feel as though I'm lying and then I'm being deceptive, I'm sorry you feel that way. Because I wasn't speaking to one person, I was speaking to 12. And the majority who voted would either vote to keep me in prison or to release me. But I remember the Sherlock Holmes and the detective novels that Peter Brooks brought inside, and how the questions were being asked and answered to get to a particular result, right? So it's about that, that dance, to not say what I think they want to hear, but to exercise my own agency and my own liberation and take it in my hands. And whatever happens, I can't control the outcome. It's not my decision, but I can control my process. That's it. And it's the same way with education in school and things like that. I can just put forth the best ideas that I can in on a paper or things like that. But what I find, what was the hardest thing for me, was coming home. I was punished inside for writing. I did 7 years on and off during my 30 years in isolated confinement because of my political writings. I have yet to write anything of my own thought when I came home because I'm on parole, and if they came in my house, they could pull it and they could use that as justification of putting me back. So I'm not free, though I'm physically free. I was sharing with Ben I have a new parole officer. I had 6 in 4 years, and I'm on level 4. And what that means is I see my parole officer once. I would see him 4 times a year, quarterly. But I have a new parole officer, and his thing is, oh, that's the minimum standard. I can see you as many times as I want, and this and that. I said, well, why have a standard if you can just do whatever you want? You have broad discretion. So we got into this back and forth thing. So he came and did a home visit to my apartment. And when he walked in, he came in triggering. I'm very conscious about my triggers. And when I'm triggered, I will let people know around me that I'm triggered and I'm not being aggressive or anything. But I said that to him. And so we get up in my apartment, and this guy says, well, I'll be back next month. I said, no, you won't. And he says, well, you are on parole. I said, yes, I am. And I said, I've earned level 4 to not have to see you every month. And then he said, well, I feel like you're being aggressive. And he said, I'm concerned for my safety. And he stepped back and put his hand on his service weapon. And when he did it, I was like, oh, snap. So I walked into my kitchen, and he walked towards me. And I said to him, I said, I thought you said that you were afraid for your safety and that I was being aggressive. I'm trying to give you space so you don't feel that way. He says, I'm going to need you to sit down. I'm in my house. So I said, I'm not going to do that. I said, are you done with your search? Are you done with whatever you came here to do? Now we're talking liberation education. Let's think about this. I am telling a person in authority now to get out of my house. He takes his flashlight and began to search my house and my living room and says, do you have me on YouTube? So I'm like, you're really triggering. So I open the living room, open the door because it's right by my living room. And I say, you have to leave. But then later on, I call Professor Ben and was like, yo, I don't know what this guy's going to do. I don't know. But immediately with our education and how we do things, one thing is due process rights. Right? I'm only asking for what I'm entitled to by due process and law. I'm not asking for anything extra. I'm not asking for any particular special treatment. The beautiful thing about everything that happened was the controversy and the abuse of discretion allowed me to navigate safely using liberation education that allowed me to survive 30 years and how to turn that into a transferable skill on the street and coming out and saying, if need be, how I survived 30 years through books, through those very things that you talked about, book clubs. We had over 1,500 books in East Jersey State Prison. We have our own library that we built. They banned the new Jim Crow. Really? Right? Blood in my eye. If you got caught with that, it is 6 months solitary confinement. Contraband immediately. You're going to the hole. Right? But my grandmother, who is Native American, she would introduce me to Red Cloud. And Red Cloud had a saying that I used every day while I served 30 years. Every day is a good day to die. Every day is a good day to die. And I never really got to thank Mr. Peter for providing that lesson in that season to liberate me from incarceration. Thank you.
I'm going to stay sitting just to acknowledge that I'm on this level. You're at that level. That was amazing. Thank you. I think that was really important. Can you hear me? Let's see. All right. I want to, of course, thank Peter for having me, inviting me, organizing this incredible symposium. I want to really process and appreciate both of the panelists here. And also, in advance, thank you for being kind to me. And I really quickly want to acknowledge and thank all of the faculty here who've taught in our prison education program, who serve on our faculty advisory committees. Caleb Smith, Elizabeth Hinton, Randall Horton, and also fellows and alumni of YPEI here. People who've worked with our program, a lot of familiar faces here, so I'm really glad that I'm gonna spare you my typical fundraising presentation. Also, I see a few members of Stop Solitary, which is cool. Yeah. So I'm punching above my weight here a little bit on this panel. I'm what you would call a practitioner, or if you're being a little less charitable, an administrator. I imagine I was asked to sit on this panel because I have something to say, not just as someone who runs a prison education program, but especially also as someone who figured out how to build one at the most unlikely of places, the university where we gather today. And the short story is, we found the glitch in the matrix. What I'd like to do with my brief time is tell you just a little bit about the program here at Yale and through our partnership with University of New Haven and what it is that we do for context. And then highlight some details and vignettes from the overlap of the twin institutions of the prison and the university that touch on the larger theme of the symposium, incarceration and imagination, and also this panel, which has been titled Incarceration, Decarceration, and Education. And because I work deeply within institutional bureaucracies of the prison and the university, one of the things I set out to do for myself in agreeing to sit on this panel is use it as an opportunity for my own reflection about the acts of imagination that were and are required in order for this program to exist. So the program was, in its own way, created by incarcerated students. The seed of origin is through Wesleyan Center for Prison Education, where myself and other faculty and graduate students at Yale had been volunteering for years and years. Around the time that I started volunteering at Cheshire through Wesleyan's prison education program in 2014, it was a semester I was supposed to be writing my dissertation. So of course I was looking for any excuse for distraction. I kept finding on campus that there were a lot of different faculty here who were really invested in this, who were excited about teaching in prison, who thought it was really important, and that it really made serious their vocation in a way that teaching on campus maybe hadn't. And so as I started going in more and more and meeting more of these faculty and graduate students who were deeply invested in Wesleyan's program or Bard's program at the Bard Prison Initiative, the students at Wesleyan encouraged me to start a program at Yale. They knew that, well, first they thought there's a lot of prisons in this state, and a lot of them don't have programs like ours. And if you could start a program at Yale, it would really benefit a lot of people. This was at Cheshire, and they said some of us had to transfer from other prisons just for the shot at applying to this program. But they also, in that program, knew that a program at Yale would have more than just a direct impact. It would have a national impact. It would inspire other institutions of higher learning, competitive institutions who, as we all know, only do things to outdo each other, that it would create this ripple effect and that it could be hugely important. If we could start a program at Yale, other programs could look to us and say, Yale did it, we can too. And that was inspiring to me to think about the possibilities if we could get that far. So a few of us started gathering together, the faculty. Oh, I want to call out Ron Jenkins, who's been teaching in prison for a long time. Ron was there at our first meeting of Yale faculty who'd been teaching in prison and who really wanted to brainstorm. This was 2014 or 2015. How would we start a program here? How would we do it? There had never before been a student in prison who could say they were part of a real Yale program, and there had never been a program that offered real Yale credits. And we also counted among us formerly incarcerated students and graduate students on our campus who'd been alumni of college and prison programs who were in graduate school or who were undergraduates even. We convened a small meeting to do this imaginative work together. What would this program look like, and how would we pull it off? As an aside, in working to build this program, I spent some time considering the history of admissions at Ivy League universities. Of course, the story of inclusive changes in admissions here and elsewhere is not ever the story of a spontaneous and benevolent increase in access to the campus, but a story of resistance by small and subordinate groups. And that is indeed the story of how our program was started. It was one of a fierce coalition of faculty, staff, students, administrators, many administrators in many offices, the registrar's offices, who, for whatever reason, believed in it. Formerly incarcerated students as well, who came to campus, attended meetings with deans at Yale and also with commissioners of correction, and who pushed until the program finally seemed inevitable, which it still seems. But one lesson I learned along the way that I thought this might be a good forum to share is that it appeared to me in this time that the university, and this is a cynical observation that maybe we can think about together, but the university is built specifically to preempt any one student or individual from creating real impact in under 4 years. 4 years is the amount of time it takes to create any sort of lasting change. I don't know how to subvert that sort of rule of thumb that I've come to understand. But in those 4 years that we pushed for this program, an incredible shift happened on this campus. And many of the deans or registrars that we met with at the beginning who truly looked at me and said, I don't physically understand what you're talking about. Do you mean inmates are coming to campus? And I'd say, no, faculty are going to drive themselves to prison, and then they're going to be in a classroom. And in that classroom, they'll, to really paint the picture. And, and we came out on the other side, and some of those deans are some of, the best evangelists of this program today. So today we have a program that operates year-round through a partnership with the University of New Haven. We offer both Yale and UNH classes for credit with faculty and sometimes graduate students from both institutions teaching. Students are matriculated in an AA in General Studies and a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies. If students are released before they complete their degree, they can seamlessly transition to on-campus enrollment at UNH, which is very unique in this field. Together, we've facilitated 431 unique enrollments in credit-bearing courses with 121 faculty, staff, and graduate students from both campuses teaching, guest lecturing, or otherwise offering access to their on-campus research and teaching. And over 200 undergraduate students have worked with us as volunteers or tutors in various capacities. This semester, we'll graduate our first students from the degree program. And today, students at Danbury Federal Prison, or women rather, at the Danbury Federal Prison, just nearby from here, are receiving admissions letters to our first cohort for a new program at that facility. We've also just been approved to facilitate federal Pell Grants in prison as a part of this national movement that Anton mentioned to restore Pell Grant access for students inside. And there is a lot to be proud of, and yet also a lot that is wrong with how things have evolved. There are things that, we didn't succeed at in building this program. And there are things that I believe we still will succeed at. And a lot of this work requires a lot of imaginative thinking. And I'll get to that in just a second. But I do quickly, and then I'm going to end. I just have several discrete acts of imagination from our prison education program that were required to build and to sustain it, right? In addition to what I just mentioned, continuing to imagine the ideal version of this program. But the first was, over those years of building it, building a program for an imaginary group of students, right? Working with current students in another program, knowing students from other programs, but nevertheless fighting through these institutions, a Department of Corrections, and an institution of higher education, to create a credit-bearing or degree-granting program for a group of students that you don't personally know, right? And so, a group of students who simply have not, have not applied to the program, right? And which is why one of the best days in our lives as, prison education administrators is admitting a new cohort of students to a prison, education program, sitting down with them and really saying, this is for you. This is being in that room, and especially with our first cohorts at any prison is really, the perfect culmination of imaginative thinking. Not the perfect culmination, a fine culmination. Another act of imagination, reading a student handbook to students in prison. It's one of the core principles of this program is really we're extending access to the same college classes, the same programming that we offer to students here. And we hold to the same rules and regulations. We hold to the same standards. And we sit there on the first day and read every little rule that students are trusted to read on their own here on campus. And reading that student handbook is a little bit odd because some of these rules simply don't apply. But the work that it does is in helping the students to understand themselves as students, as peers to students on our campus, that they are bound to those same ways of being a student. A third act of imagination is the way we constantly use and reimagine the Yale mission statement. We use as our mission statement for YPEI the mission statement of Yale College, to seek exceptionally promising students of all backgrounds from across the nation and around the world, and to educate them through mental discipline and social experience to develop their intellectual, moral, civic, and creative capacities to the fullest. The aim of this education is the cultivation of citizens with a rich awareness of our heritage to lead and serve in every sphere of human activity. So we take this mission statement and we read it every day through an abolitionist lens. And the way we do that is we imagine that if we can imagine together a post-carceral future, then the leaders of that future may very well be incarcerated today, are incarcerated today. And in that scenario, the charge of the university is to invest now in those students as future leaders and citizens. So you don't have to change anything about the mission statement to read it through that lens, but it is a way that we have to work to imagine it serving a different purpose. My fourth act of imagination is a little anecdote, and then I'll cut myself off because I have many acts of imagination. Creating Yale within the prison is an interesting practice for us. If you can imagine, our faculty, our volunteers, and our staff are a certain subset of Yale citizens. And we bring in a lot of the faculty that you see here. And there's a lot of undergraduates who volunteer, who are students of color, or who are radical activists, who believe, there's a lot of community in the people who enter the prison. And I remember one day a couple years ago, we had a sort of, as Peter mentioned, I went to undergrad and grad school here. And we had a student who was volunteering who maybe more fit your traditional. He was like a very tall lacrosse player, very white and blonde. And he came into the prison, and, our students are mostly black and brown from, neighborhoods in Connecticut cities. And they they looked at this guy and they said, he doesn't look like a Yale student to me. And I was like, oh yeah, we've created like an ER&M college at McDougall Walker Correctional Institution. And it was a really strange feeling because especially a couple years ago when this happened, there wasn't very much interest in teaching or learning in the program. We had, some interest, but that semester we had Rod Ferguson and Lisa Lowe and Dan Hosang and Leah Miracore co-teaching ER&M because that was all we could do. And so, having that kind of reality check was really, it was a weird moment, but it also helped me think about how we've created this version of Yale. We've imagined this version of Yale within the prison. Okay, and I'm going to end with just a little reflection and something maybe slightly uncomfortable. I'm super grateful to be sitting here next to Anton. There's something a little bit strange about being at this symposium. I don't have an answer to this. This is just my notes. A little bit strange about being at a symposium with scholars and writers, and everyone's got a friend in prison, or a person they write letters to or about, or who they teach or refer to. It's a little bit itchy. But it also does this really important work we were talking earlier about making the invisible visible, bringing to the forefront of discussion people who are hidden from view, people actively currently in prison. And am I out of time?
Just us, So.
Yeah, okay. I just had like a little paragraph, but a little bit off topic, but my background is in film studies, and one thing I've written about is background actors in classical Hollywood. So in the 20s and 30s, there were these cycles of prison films that fetishized using actual prison locations, often with the permission of like a very enthusiastic Hollywood-hungry warden. And then beyond that, they would use actual prisoners in the backgrounds of the films. And in most of these scenarios, it was required by the prison and by the motion picture industry that the background actors could not be portrayed in any degree of specificity lest they require fair compensation. So sometimes in the backgrounds of films that would take place in prison, you'd see people who were incarcerated, but they were masked in order to suppress their identity, their portrait, you see. And I wasn't even going to talk about this, but after the rest of I was sort of thinking about it, and I'm thinking about this history and the work that people are doing in accompanying portraits of individuals on the inside, making this sort of invisible visible. Yeah, that's it. I'll end there.
Thanks, Elda. I want to leave some time, if I can, too, for some questions from the audience. I'm sure after these terrific presentations, there will be some. So I'm Ben Berger, Swarthmore College. Like Tracy Mears before me, I'm going to try to respond not just to the terrific presentations we've had here, but also to some of the things that have been said earlier in the day, and even at the dinner last night for presenters, to try to give maybe a little bit of a sense of all the things that have tied us together. I'm really grateful, as others are as well, to Peter for bringing us together. And there's this kind of simpatico on this particular panel. I met Peter when I was at Princeton. I was the Rockefeller visiting professor for distinguished teaching there, and he had been the same thing a few years before. We connected through that. I was teaching a class, an inside-out class. That is to say, I brought Princeton students into East Jersey State Prison, and they took a class alongside the incarcerated students. That was something that Peter was interested in doing as well. We talked a lot about that. He had taught at EJSP. He had taught Tone, who had come home already, and Tone became my guide to figure out. I was experienced at prison teaching, but every institution is different, and you've got to figure out what to do where, and the kind of advice I got from Tone was just invaluable. And it wasn't just at the beginning of the semester, it was throughout the semester. Bernard and I have talked about, know a lot of people in common because we've gone to some of the same schools. He's just done a lot more than I have, but I don't hold that against him. And his book, Critique and Practice, is fabulous, and you should get it because it's informed my thinking about some of what we're talking about today. It's a recent book, and it's not just if you want to understand critical theory, but also if you really want to understand actually what a critical theorist and one who's also an activist might do in pushing back against himself, always questioning, am I doing enough? Am I doing the right thing? Which is something that all of us ought to be doing, really. The overarching theme that I want to bring together is the one of imagination. Bernard reminds us with the example of reading groups in the carceral spaces, and Tone reinforces with his really moving examples of them, that things don't happen. We don't build things unless we can imagine them. Right? Unless they already happen to us in our experience, or if we can imagine them. And books are one way of doing that. And not just books, but then talking about books with other people as well. So that's the basic power of imagination to help us to figure out what we might be able to build. That just can't be underestimated. I want to recount a few things from other panels to set the stage for what we're talking about here. Joy James this morning wondered about the protective mechanism that authors of fiction might be able to offer the incarcerated if some incarcerated people have difficulty being seen by the public. Now, Caleb pointed out that there are some truths that people in power don't want incarcerated writers to tell, or other writers to tell about the incarcerated. There's a double bind. You want to say the right thing, but not say too much and not get in trouble with the powers that be. And Rachel Kushner shared with us the story of the poetry editor that said for a prisoner's bio, they could include only the person's name, age, where they were incarcerated, and the crime for which they were convicted. That was the bio. Nothing else about the person. There was a kind of vanishing, a kind of erasure, a strict control over the resources that readers might be able to access when they create the film in their mind of thinking about life for that incarcerated person. And I think most of us agree that's not an accident. It's not an accident. There is strict control. Tony, the story you told about the parole officer, even outside the prison, and the control that's exercised, it's not an accident. One of the things that struck me most forcefully when I started doing prison teaching was this intentional erasure of bodies and personalities, a vanishing of people, not just from the broader public, but sometimes even from families as well, the inability to bring pictures out. My group at Princeton, we took a class picture. We had somebody from one of the photography groups come in and take a picture of us. I smuggled that out. I wasn't supposed to have it get out of the prison. It seems ridiculous. Why shouldn't we have a picture of us there? But we weren't. All right, even images weren't supposed to go out. And so it's one of the reasons why I appreciate not only prison education programs in general, like Zelda, the one you've created here, and my hat is off to you, but especially the Inside Out model that was created at Graterford Prison, now called the Phoenix, and Temple University. So I practice the Inside Out model. People all over the world do it as well. That is where, like at Princeton that one year, right, you have a class inside the carceral facility, and there are students from your home institution, they're the outside students, together with the incarcerated students, they're the inside students, and you're reading the same books, you're writing the same papers, having the same discussions. They are transformative. But what they also do is they allow outside students to go home and realize and tell other people too, this is the kind of erasure. I saw what's actually going on, and it's not what's being portrayed out here. So it's one way in which, a little way in which, their imaginations and what they convey to others can be expanded in terms of possibly changing things as well. Zelda, this great work you've done, again, here with Yale, we're trying around Swarthmore and in Pennsylvania more broadly to create our own kind of prison education system. We're woefully, Villanova's got its own great program, but PA doesn't. We're trying to kind of copy what's in New Jersey. I learned so much about NJ Step through Tone, where there is one central school, that's Rutgers, that grants the BAs, no matter who at what school, Drew, Princeton, wherever, might teach a class inside, but Rutgers is the BA granting institution. And then Raritan Valley Community College is the AA granting institution. We're trying to do something like that with Penn State as the main one, so that when I teach a course inside, my students have credit towards a Penn State degree or a community college degree. But here's the thing, and I want to raise this to Bernard and also to Zelda. This is not really a critique. I want to lift something up as kind of an expansion, not a critique. And it came up last night at dinner with Rich Rivera and Tone. We had a fabulous conversation about inside life, but also coming home and reentry, and about parole boards as well. And Rich made the really interesting point that, shouldn't come as a surprise to us, but sometimes you got to have things brought to the level of consciousness to really deal with them. That, of course, we don't want to just hold everybody inside before they come home or before they're considered a success, that they are like Tone or Rich. Or people you've met who have come home often are just amazing people. They would have succeeded anywhere in the world. There are people who had the drive to go through a college degree, to become paralegals, to do all kinds of stuff, but there are many paths to success, and it doesn't have to come necessarily just through books, a particular kind of book, a particular kind of discussion group. Now, it doesn't invalidate. We're dedicated to that. We're intellectuals. We're academics. Rich pointed out that if you play basketball for 20 years, you're dedicated to that. It takes more than we can recognize because it's a scarce resource. Courts are a scarce resource. Being able to stay dedicated, focused, stay out of trouble, the many different things you've got to do to be able to do that for 20, 25 years, that's stuff that will work on the outside too. That's stuff that needs to be recognized as well. So it may be one thing that some of us here can try to lift up to the broader public, who can put pressure on parole boards to say, well, it's not just one way. You don't have to be someone who's got a perfect GPA or something to be able to come home. Again, that's an expansion, not a critique, I think, of what you guys are working towards. And Zelda, I was asking Zelda just before this, but I'd love to talk afterwards too about the possibility of bridge programs for folks who aren't ready right away to come in and start a college program inside, but want to, having tutors in place, having Yale tutors in place or wherever the school is to help to get them to the level where now you're ready to start. All right? And so we're not only dealing with people who say, I want to read Mao right now, I want to read Marx right now. Right? So there's lots of paths to that kind of success I'm drawn to. Let me just say one thing about imagination broadly. It was the theme of today. So we talked about like visibility, and Tracy gave a great little sort of pushback about visibility. Well, maybe that's not enough because some things are visible, but they don't necessarily lead to change. We may ignore them. We may push back against them. So what I want to specify with imagination is that imagination needs building blocks. It needs food, not food for thought, but food for imagination. So I think a little bit of Thomas Hobbes. You don't have to like Hobbes' overall political theory or even endorse his atomistic approach to the world to like this, what I'm going to put out there. He says imagination, it's particles, it's particulate. So since the world meets us here through our experiences, our sense organs process that, and then afterwards, the kind of echoes of that, they become available to us, these faint imprints as imagination. But it's only things we've encountered already. You can't imagine something you had no idea about. You might encounter it through somebody else telling you about it or through your experience. We need food. We need particles to feed the imagination. And Zach said something earlier about novelists possibly being able to order and organize the particles that the rest of the world sees. That's what I want to put out there. There's lots of information that could come out to make things less invisible about prisons, but we need people who are going to be able to organize the particles into something then that can expand the popular imagination about what's actually happening and what could happen as well. So I heard a lot of sub-themes like that today. I just want to kind of lift that up. I hear that in today's panelists as well. To build, to rebuild, to reform, reboot, to revolutionize, we have to be able to imagine it. Now, just because you can imagine something doesn't mean that it's possible. You could imagine flying pigs, and maybe genetic engineering, well, I don't know what that's going to come up with. But right now, they're not possible. So it may not be sufficient, but it's necessary. You got to be able to imagine it. And that's what we've got to expand. So let me see. I'm going to say only a couple more things so I can get to some other questions and comments on the panelists. Right. Tone, when we go to questions and conversation, I'd love to invite you to expand on something that we've talked about before, and you've also talked about with Bernard, with Zelda, with Peter on different occasions, about a way of expanding imagination through changing the rhetoric and no longer talking perhaps about just crime, but about public health, the public health model. I'd love you to invite you to do that once I wrap up here. I think it's really deep, and it shows the importance of rhetoric to organize the particles, to be able to get people on board. Because here's the other thing. I think the folks here are probably pretty much on the same page when it comes to a lot of issues regarding the carceral state, to a lot of issues regarding injustice and what needs to change. But it's a big country. And not everybody agrees. And we've seen some horrifying examples of polarization. And yet you need other people. Unless you just want to think that a very small band are going to change everything. And we saw that kind of on January 6th, and it thankfully didn't work out. But unless you want to go that path, you need a lot of people to be brought in. And so you may need to put things in other languages as well. I sometimes wonder if it wouldn't be better to have something like a situation comedy written by incarcerated folks, but at many different institutions, so that the stories they're talking about couldn't be recognizable all coming from one place. But their stories, real stories, within characters who are humanized, for lack of a better word, to the larger population. Sitcoms and popular culture, music also, hip-hop music, those things get through to a lot of people in a way that languages often don't, and can create the atmosphere for social change. So I don't care if it's a sitcom or what the thing is. I just mean stories that go out there that aren't just accusatory and that actually say, a lot of us share the same things here. A lot of us know people who are in prison. A lot of us have relatives, whether we are living in this part of the country, that part of the country, we're all hurt by this. Our communities are hurt when people are taken out of the workforce. Our families are hurt when parents are taken out of the parenting environment, and that's something that we all share. So I want to invite us to think about together different ways beyond also just the academic, although I am an academic, of course. All right. Last thing, engaged scholarship. Peter mentioned that I direct the center at Swarthmore. Its focus is engaged scholarship. It used to be community-based learning. When I came in, we changed it to engaged scholarship because it's broader. It lets a lot more faculty in who are doing maybe things on public policy, maybe things that aren't just about working in a particular local community. Ernest Boyer coined that term. What he meant by it was engaged scholarship is orienting the resources of the university towards our most pressing public problems, issues, ethical issues, civic issues, etc. However, what Boyer missed was this. It's more than that now. What we try to do now is perspective taking. You've got to be problem solvers with folks who are affected by stuff, not for them. That's what this work is doing. It's why all the kind of educational stuff you're talking about is so important. It's what Tone and I have done together. Tone and other people at EGSP made me see, I just never thought about it before. Those who are making policy for reentry, all right, have no experience with reentry at all themselves. All right? Being informed by people who are inside, who are about to come out, those who have recently come out, and their families who actually know something about what's needed is just the obvious way to go. In fact, it seems idiotic to do any other way, and yet we do it every other way but that. So I just want to call on even more doing things with to be able to get better solutions. That's the kind of thing I'm inspired by today. A lot of people doing with, and doing with expands our imagination tremendously. So thanks very much for everyone being here.
Yeah, let's have questions from one another, to one another for a few minutes, and then we'll open it to the audience.
To answer Ben's question, while inside, one of the biggest hurdles to get over was public safety. How do you bring in a chess program and play Princeton University students when it's a threat to public safety, it's threat to the people that are coming into the institutions, and it's a threat that if someone takes a hostage to the safety of the guards and how they run things. So what we did was through what we call liberation education, we was introduced to a concept called public health, right? This is a way of changing the health of this institution. And this, at the time, I was incarcerated in Trenton State Prison, now known as New Jersey State Prison. I did 20 years there, and I did my last 10 at East Jersey. And what wound up happening was, when we won that first argument by framing it through a public health lens, this will reduce violence, this will reduce different things, it'll teach cognitive thinking, critical engagement, it'll do a lot of things just with this. So our first, our tournament was with Princeton. We had 60 people, but I think Trenton is 1,100 people, 800 signed up. And then it became an instrument to incentivize. And we wind up being on ESPN while we were inside. Most people don't look at chess as a sport, but chess is a sport, right? So when I tell the youth that I work with right now in Rutgers Youth Success Program in Camden, I said, I was on ESPN. Mr. Tone, you capping. I'm like, and I was in Sports Illustrated. Yeah, right. Right. You ain't got no game like that. But
I've got the article on my computer here if you
Yeah.
want to see it later on. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and a lot of people, like when I opened it up, and it was like, well, how was y'all able to do that in there? And I said, through the public health space, right, and a harm reduction strategy. And it greatly reduced institutional violence because people wanted to get into the chess club in order to play against Princeton like the elite. Like they thought they were something, and they would do all of that. And what wound up happening was, when I got to East Jersey, that's how we introduced the concept to the administrators and the Commissioner of Corrections using a public health argument. I've never lost a public health argument in an institution, right? And coming home and bringing that same carceral organizing to the community, it's like, I remember I've never been to Brooklyn in my life. I only seen Brooklyn in the movies and on TV. And I went to Brooklyn, and we were in this housing project. And I remember giving a presentation and saying, well, we don't have to defund the police, right? I said, all we have to do is repurpose the money to public health and address the public health and treatment as opposed to punishment. And you can continue to do what you want over here, but we're going to address it through a public health lens and a harm reduction strategy. And what wound up happening was, one of the side effects of the talks is when I got off the stage and I walked down, the police started surrounding me. And immediately I got triggered, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I say now? Like, here we go. And they all came, and when they surrounded me, they was like, I did not understand what you said about we didn't have to defund the police. Can you explain it? I said, if we strictly focus on dealing with the social issues through a public health model and a harm reduction strategy, there's money already sitting there in surplus that we're not using. There's billions and billions of dollars there. And it's not reaching the communities that desperately need them, especially black and brown communities. So I remember it was Sergeant Morgan. He's probably the only second officer that I ever shook hands with. And he was like, can I have your phone number and can I have your email address? So I'm looking at my guys, Umar Dollard, and most of the people that I work with have served inordinate amount of time. The minimum is 28 years. The highest is 52 years. And we imagined while we were inside, we have our own school that we purchased from the Board of Education in the city of Camden. We have our own studio. We have our own cameras, green screen production. We have our own business district. But because we imagined it when it didn't exist and came home and manifested through a public health agenda and a harm reduction strategy.
We have a very patient audience. I think we should give them a voice now, if that's okay with the rest of you. Questions? Yes.
And-
There's a mic somewhere.
Yes, right there, yeah.
It's on? Hi, my name is Charlie. First of all, I would like to thank you guys for having this event. I found out about it on Facebook. I served about 2 decades, came home recently, and I'm still shaking off the shackles of being institutionalized. And I would just like to invite anybody that would like to pick my mind, maybe through I have a mountain of experience and knowledge on this topic. And I would just like to give back in any way I can. So if anybody would like to reach out and pick my mind, I'm here. You can catch me at charlierockld prisonmentality@gmail.com.
Welcome home, Charlie.
Thank you, guys.
Come on, yeah.
Rachel?
Yes, a question for any of the 5 of you who would care to answer it. Thanks, those presentations were amazing. I sometimes, sorry, a little going to elect myself a sort of state of mystery, not of the state, but as a Californian, we have the scope and particularity of our prison system is maybe somewhat unique, but it's very unnatural, I think, that incarceration involves a separation of the genders. And women's prisons in California, I'm sorry to generalize, but I'm going to, because I would really like to hear what you all think about this. Like the culture of learning and intellectual strength and enriching the mind and having an interior life that is inviolable by the staff and the guards, that is not really robust in California women's prisons. And I've had long conversations with people inside prison about this, and people explain things to me about why it's not robust, and they have real reasons. Like, you don't understand what it's like in here. Most people come from profound trauma. They're trying to order their mind all the time and deal with a kind of high drama environment where there's 8 people to a room, et cetera, et cetera. No one has privacy. And so it has not been one of the main avenues to a kind of psychic or mental liberation for people. And I was wondering if you could just talk about your experiences as teachers and as students, and whether this comes up in other places. Is California unique in that way? And if not, like, how to think about this uneven distribution of forms of liberation through intellectual work, through reading.
So, like I said, we started our programming in the federal women's prison today, this morning. People were delivered their admissions letters. So I can't speak with much expertise about, I'll tell you, women's prisons are different. We've, already in just the short while that we've been, we had information sessions and ran interviews there. But I do think, I'm not sure what security level those prisons are. There is, what you described sounds similar to the environment of this prison where we're working, which is essentially, it is literally a warehouse that was purchased by the Bureau of Prisons and converted into a satellite location for the federal prison. And so the women who are there are in one large gymnasium type room. And so the boundaries between people are not there. There's a lot of, I suspect you might be right. But I really don't know in particular. But I do think that security level has a lot to do with what is possible and able to happen, which is a little bit of an oxymoron because we found in the high maximum adult prison where we work, which is, no prison is where anybody should be or ideal, but it's especially not ideal. But people at least have some alone time, and then they have communal time in the prison where we are. At the women's prison where women are put in one room, there isn't that alone time. We really are going to have to build it out, right? Spaces, especially. Spaces are really important in this context. Finding a space for people to have a group that is able to meet not just once a week, but every single day. To be in an environment where you can imagine yourself as a college student, not just Wednesday evenings, but all the time.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that women have, within this space of the invisible, women in prison have been the invisible within the invisible throughout much of the history since the 1970s. But I think, I think it's going to be context and history and person specific. In New York, a lot of the work and the teaching I've been doing at Rikers has been at Rosie's, which is the women's facility, and there was a big emphasis on providing courses from Columbia at Rosie's in particular, and the Columbia Justice and Education program in part was built by Kathy Boudin and Cheryl Wilkins, and has really dedicated a lot to the Bedford facility. So in part, I think it's going to be somewhat path dependent on who it is that's doing the work and spearheading the efforts and stuff.
It's you raise an interesting question, and which is the irony is we look to California and the writings from California on the East Coast, and they're on the West Coast, and what you just proposed was sort of what reminds me of what just happened it's been happening for quite a while in Edna Mahan in New Jersey, with the beatings and the rapes and the things of women, and where they have this institution, right? So one of the things is what I was annexing in a lot of our protests was the location of the prison, right? You treat it the same way you treat domestic violence people, women, and how they do. The first thing they did was isolate them, right? They put them in a far out place where nobody can get to them. That's what most DV violators do, right? So the institution is not by any public transportation. You can't get there by train, bus, or anything. And they're remote. And that isolation, that isolation serves as a means of social control inside the carceral space. And when you do it that way, right, it's by design. So what they're manifesting and what they're explaining to you. So it's like when I began to, we have a program called Meet 'em at the Gate. And it started with anybody that's coming home. We go to the institutions no matter how far. Well, New Jersey is a pretty densely populated state, so we can get to all, right now I think we have 9. We can get to all 9. But Edna Mahan is the hardest. But then I quickly learned that I was ill-equipped to handle the needs of women coming home from incarceration. I don't know what to buy a woman. I don't know what a 5'6" is or a 0 or nothing like that. I don't know how to do those things. So what I did was I began to collaborate with Cass Severe, who came home, who also served time at Edna Mahan, and then she took Meet 'em at the Gate and turned it into Meet Her at the Gate, and addressed and was duplicating what we were doing on the male side for the female side. And one thing we all have to understand in this country, women are the most underserved population in the carceral state of America. There's no services for them. And that's what you're experiencing. And the thing is that this is what this is about. How do we begin to imagine spaces or opportunities or tactics and strategies to bring forth those solutions or methodologies?
Hi, thank you so much. Oh, that's loud. I've just been thinking about this kind of all day today. And Zelda, you mentioned reading the mission statement through an abolitionist lens, kind of hoping for or imagining a post-carceral state being led by those that are currently incarcerated today. And I'm curious, for most of you that are working at these larger institutions that are still culpable for increased policing in Black and brown neighborhoods, under the guise of protecting mostly white students, how do we contend with those two truths or multiple truths while leading these great programs and just existing in those multiple realities?
Great question. Thanks. It's that's obviously a big problem at Yale, at Columbia, and many of these institutions. The way I've tried to think about it is that at these institutions there are some people who are doing extraordinary things, and some great centers for justice and others elsewhere. And that there are also these other spaces that are causing harm. And you have to, in a way, I kind of feel as if I don't want to give up claiming the space for the good projects by ceding the ground to the nefast, in a way. And so, I mean, I try as much as possible to promote and foster and support those spaces that are doing good, and also fighting against the other tentacles of these abominable institutions.
I think Judith Resnick had her hand up in the back there.
Thanks. I just wanted to engage a little bit more with the gender question, because obviously the institutions are constructed by and construct a gender. Women are about 10% of the incarcerated population. In the stuff we do on solitary, Black women are way over constrained in solitary than white women, even though solitary is used less in women's facilities, in facilities designated for women than facilities designated for men. But I'm thinking in terms of Rachel and some of the other comments about in the late 70s, the U.S. House held hearings, Women the Forgotten Offender, apropos the left out, not much on the screen. At the time, the federal facilities had no things called camps, which are the least secure facilities for women at all. But after a lot of activism, then there became a camp actually at Danbury, and then a women's facility for about 1,100 people, till the Federal Bureau of Prisons in about 2012-13 decided to proposed to move 1,000 women to Aliceville, Alabama, which is a bad place to be if you're from Alabama, let alone elsewhere, because it's extremely remote, near the Mississippi border. So the women actually who remain, a lot of fight, and a small facility for women remains. And in the wake of COVID, and about 100 people got out on home confinement. There's a group called the Danbury 100, organized by these amazing women who have pulled together and connected people who are on home confinement and are a big fight about being reincarcerated there. So I was wondering about whether the activism and engagement for women is differently engaged, expressed, and or seen even when it exists, and or suppressed, and also what the sort of library resources are, including the inside out stuff, as well as the ways Kathy Boudin and other people's activism at Bedford was instrumental in transforming the facility after an enormous amount of fighting, but she also had a huge amount of access to resources to make visible her conflicts around it. So one of the projects for the narrative imagination would be to try to probe Rachel's how and where and when are women's facilities underseen, underserved, underengaged, re-engaged, or differently engaged, and how might one make more accessible the work from the work that's going on inside outside, as well as outside work going inside.
One of the biggest hurdles is when women come home and they enter into relationships, right? And most of their partners force them back into silence, right? They don't want anybody to know that their significant other, loved one, partner, wife, fiance has been incarcerated. So you go from an environment that does that to coming home and being in a relationship that also continues that same process. So when we're out in front of Edna Mahan and we're advocating, we're calling for services, we're calling for not reform but transformation of a system that isolates and abuses with impunity, it was hard to organize amongst the women. And when the ones that did come out, that was the first time, like it was like a history in New Jersey to be able to do that. And I understand like that stigma is harder on, I had to learn that it was harder on women than it was on men. Why? Because they're the mothers. They're the daughters, right? That gender specific, what you asked, is a lot of things that become what we call in new entry pop-up barriers. Right, to being able to tell that story, to be able to go before a Senate hearing or Capitol Hill, or wherever you have to go, right? It's almost like they're sworn into secrecy and silence, even after the custodial term has been served. And that's something that we have to imagine. What can we do to bring them out and to bring them in safe spaces where they can tell their stories, if anonymously or specifically, without any other harm occurring to them? And that's the dilemma that we face.
Very interesting. I'll take one more question in the back there. You've been very patient waiting.
Thank you. I just wanted to expand on the question of the previous person. My name is Adamu, and I served over 15 years in California state prisons. And my question is around how y'all as educators that go inside of prisons or run programs that go inside of prisons balance. I heard one person talk about using an abolitionist lens or abolitionist mission. How do you balance the tension between that and the fact that educational programs can be considered a reform. And so, just that reforms, in fact, strengthen the system, that, the history of prisons is a history of reforms. Just a quick story. I went and visited Norway this summer, and toured their prison system. And what I saw there was a lot of the same things. I mean, Norway has, in some ways, done prisons in a way that's more palatable for their society and for the world. And what I saw was like a lot of different countries sending contingents there to tour their system, to bring it back to their countries so that they could like quell rebellion. And so I just think about, for myself, like education inside was a place, just like one of y'all talked about, where it felt non-carceral. It felt like we could share ideas and there wasn't the threat of, prison guards, and there was some level of equity between students. But that also the prison uses that as a way to strengthen itself and to show like what we're doing and what, like these are the advancements that we're making. And like if we have an abolitionist vision, like our ultimate goal is not to have better universities inside of prisons, but to like not have prisons at all, right? And then like maybe that's good enough. But I was just gonna say that also like Yale is not just an institution that has like a police force, but also Yale is an institution that functions in a lot of ways like the prison. It excludes certain people and includes certain people just in the same way that prisons do. And so like that's also a tension that exists too, right?
Yes.
So
I mean, like the short answer is yes. All of that is absolutely right. To answer the first question, I think the way that I would answer, right? Is it a reformist reform or is it a non-reformist reform? I simply believe that what we're doing is a non-reformist reform, and the shortest way I have of explaining that is that it helps people get out of prison. Like you heard this story, you heard Anton's story. We have students who were sentenced to life in prison, and who were able to go through, up to a parole board or get a sentence modification or a commutation, and for whom, having a Yale transcript or showing that they could enroll right away at UNH was not a small thing, and truly led to people being freed from prison. And to me, investing them with that sort of freedom, but also, power to then be in the world and making, the advancements towards abolition, towards, and I really appreciated actually what Bernard said about, this, it's a battle, right? Yale isn't one thing. We all carry this label with us, and then you have this responsibility of acting with it attached to you. It is a stigma, right? Just you compared Yale to the prison, it is also a stigma, just like the prison. And when we first started, researching for this program, I would go to every, there's a women's resettlement working group and a reentry roundtable in New Haven, and I'd go to every, one of these meetings with my friend James, who was an alum of the Wesleyan program, and they would yell. People from the community would yell at us. Yale, you did this to me. You did this to me. You did this to me. And in a way, like, yes, we had to sit there and say, like, yes, I have benefited from this institution that has done every single thing you said, and yet we're trying to build out something that can be a part of this, if you're imagining a battle of good and evil, but at least, you're staking more and more people for this side of a cause that is moving towards, ideally not building a perfect university in a prison, but building away from having the prison, moving people outside of there, investing, power and leadership potential into those, students who were, identifying and investing all of our energy and money and everything else into.
Really quickly, I mean, I think all of these things are double-edged swords. and they're complicated. Conversion stories are double-edged swords as well, right? Because not everyone, because for all the people who've gone through conversion stories, as Caleb was telling us, I mean, or the limits of conversion stories is all of those who've been so damaged by the prison that there isn't a conversion story. And education also, all those who, and it becomes something, it becomes the test or the way, or a way to get out of prison, but it also fails for so many others. So these are really double-edged swords and complicated questions. And I'm someone actually who doesn't believe in non-reformist reform. I think non-reformist reform is just an oxymoron. It's just an easy way out of a complicated situation as an abolitionist. But I would say that as a personal as my own ethical responsibility, I cannot simply give up on friends and people who are in prison. And even if it's going to be, and so there's a point at which there's just an ethical responsibility to care for others. And one way we can do it is through reading and sharing and talking and thinking. And so I don't view it as a non-reformist reform. I don't think it, I don't view revolution as, well, you got to come to the situation where it's really so bad that people are going to revolt. I think you do abolitionist work and you also care. And that means going in and sharing.
Abolition.
I think that's a good note on which to end, and I refers back to Antone's notion of liberation education as an imaginative ideal. But I also think of the fact that of the class of 25 that Antone was a member of, so far as I know, 23 of them still are in East Jersey. And so liberation is a great ideal, and it also has its limitations. Listen, we reconvene in 15 minutes at 4 o'clock for our readings by Randall Horton and Richard Rivera. And after that, when they're done, there'll be a reception upstairs in room 131, to which you are all warmly invited.